What really changed me was not the University of Chicago. It was my first job working in a professional capacity for the government. I was a summer intern.
This is after Chicago? Or
No, while I was still a graduate student.
Got it.
And so during the summer vacation, I worked in the U.S. Department of Labor. And I began to realize, from a number of things, that the government is not simply the personification of the general will like Rousseau or others. The government is the government institutions have their own institutional interests. One involved the minimum wage law. I was a big supporter of that. But I also knew that there was an argument that minimum wage law simply priced low-wage workers out of a job. Mm-hmm. And my first assignment dealt with minimum wages in Puerto Rico. And as I looked at the numbers, I would see as they would jack up the minimum wages, the number of jobs would go down and so forth. But there were two explanations. One was that of the economists, that you priced the people out of a job. And the other was that there were hurricanes that had come through Puerto Rico, you see, during the sugar harvesting. And therefore, and I was studying the sugar industry, and therefore it destroyed a lot of the crop. Therefore, you wouldn't hire as many workers. Now in Chicago, I had been taught that if there are two different theories, there should be some empirical evidence in principle that could distinguish what would happen under one theory from what would happen under the other.
Because the fact is that the programs that are labeled as being for the poor, for the needy, almost always have effects exactly the opposite of those which their well-intentioned sponsors intend them to have.
Not just Senator Manchin, but any person who thinks that a $15 minimum wage is the crazy socialist agenda is living in a dystopian capitalist nightmare. And we should not prop that up. We should not continue that. People are sleeping in their cars. They can't afford baby formula. There are basic goods that people can't afford to live on $7.25. It is deeply, deeply shameful that we are even having this conversation, because when you take the minimum wage from several decades ago and you actually account for inflation and productivity gains to today, it should be $24 an hour. So we need other Democrats to understand how deep of a compromise $15 an hour is.
Right. And so I wrestled with that for most of the summer. And one morning I came in and I said, I got it. What we need are data on the amount of sugar cane standing in the fields before the hurricane struck. And as I waited for the congratulations, I could see stricken looks around me in the room. Like, this guy has stumbled on something that will ruin us all. You know? And they said, well, we don't have those data. I said, oh, I'll bet the Department of Agriculture has it. And he said, well, but that doesn't mean we have it. You'd have to have a request go up the chain of command to the Secretary of Labor. He would then confer with the Secretary of Agriculture. It would come down the chain of command in the Department of Agriculture to whoever has those numbers and so on. I said, good. Well, they say a journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step. So I will now submit my request to the Secretary of Labor, which I did. And I am still patiently awaiting this reply.
And the institutional fear of the number was what? That it would...
The U.S. Department of Labor administers the minimum wage law.
I see.
And the money and the careers of perhaps a third or some other significant percentage of the Labor Department's resources come from administering the minimum wage law. One of the real farces of all this is that the law itself, Section 4D, I still remember, requires the Labor Department to study the employment effects of minimum wages. And those studies are absolutely a farce. In fact, some years after I left, I did an article saying why those studies were a farce. And when I came back later on to the Labor Department to do some research, one of the older librarians who remembered me turned to the younger librarian and she said, this is the man who wrote that article that has everybody up in arms.
Can I ask you one question?
To like the video?
Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you.
To have.
As an example, what are you referring to?
Let me give you a very simple example. Take the minimum wage law. It's well-meaning sponsors. There are always in these cases two groups of sponsors. There are the well-meaning sponsors, and there are the special interests who are using the well-meaning sponsors as front men. You almost always, when you have bad programs, have an unholy coalition of the do-gooders on the one hand and the special interests on the other. The minimum wage law is as clear a case as you could want. The special interests are, of course, the trade unions, the monopolistic craft trade unions in particular. The do-gooders believe that by passing a law saying that nobody shall get less than $2 an hour or $2.50 an hour or whatever the minimum wage is, you are helping poor people who need the money. You are doing nothing of the kind.
So you began to be dissuaded of Marxism
and of government in general, because the government is not out there at the personification of the national interest.
Right.
They have their own interests, and the Labor Department was clearly an interest in keeping the minimum wage, because that's their jobs and careers and power.
Your fellow House Democrat Ro Khanna is saying Democrats should just override the parliamentarian. Your fellow Squad member Ilhan Omar is saying fire the parliamentarian, as the Republicans did in 2001 to get their tax cuts through. Do you agree with either of them? And if not, what do you think needs to happen now to get that $15 minimum wage passed?
You know, I do believe that we should override the parliamentarian. I think that this is a matter of course, and that our constituents and people across this country put Democrats in power to, among many other things, establish a $15 minimum wage.
15 an hour, and I totally advocate bumping that up to 16. Workers have rights. Let's get behind our workforce, because they're saying that publicly, grandstanding, but they know they just took Tommy's Toy Store out of business. Yep. And Billy's Boutique out of business, and Patty Pat Cakes out of it. Like all these small little businesses that you're talking about in Kansas, I can't do $15 an hour. I can't do $18 an hour. I can barely do $12. And so on the surface, the Andy Jazzies of the world are going to come out there and grandstand. But low key, it's because they're putting any small competitors out of business, and that's how they develop their monopoly.
The minimum wage law is most properly described as a law saying employers must discriminate against people who have low skills. That's what the law says. The law says here's a man who has a skill which would justify a wage rate of $1.50, $2 an hour. You may not employ him. It's illegal, because you have to. If you employ him, you have to pay him $2.50. Well, what's the result? To employ him at $2.50 is to engage in charity. Now, there's nothing wrong with charity, but most employers are not in a position where they can engage in that kind of charity.
Did you
subscribe? Well, you should.
I thank you.
Okay, let's do a little math. Let's do a little fast case study. Remember when New York, which goes back about 7 years ago, said, hey, we're going to do, McDonald's and all these places, and they specifically called out fast food, and they said $15 an hour. Remember that? Remember that whole thing? Mm-hmm. Okay. And you remember what showed up, I think it was a year and a half later? Kiosks. 2 ordering kiosks showed up, and 2 counter people were no longer needed. Okay, now watch this.
You're saying order your food at the kiosk to tap it in rather than ordering it at the counter.
Right.
Yes.
So there's 2 people at the counter and 2 kiosks now at a mid-sized McDonald's. Watch what happens. The 2 people are now up to $15 an hour. The 2 kiosks, I pay them electricity. So now I have 2 people, that's $30 an hour, but I have 4 working units. Divide 30 by 4. $7.50.
Yep. Wow.
Now my total labor cost to take orders is $7.50 an hour, because I have 2 humans and 2 kiosks. What also happens is the large part of the market solves problems that politicians cause. And if you invoke costs, the innovation is going to come from innovative companies that are trying to solve that, because they're ultimately trying to be profitable and make a return for the shareholders. And that's a great, simple little case study on how McDonald's was forced to pay $7.50 an hour, but the true labor cost for 4 counter workers was forced to be paying $15 an hour for 2 humans, which is $30 over an hour, but they have 2 kiosks working. Divide by 4 is back to $7.50 an hour.
Thus, the consequences of minimum wage rates have been almost wholly bad, to increase unemployment and to increase poverty. Moreover, the effects have been concentrated on the groups that the do-gooders would most like to help.
It's such a great case example, because we've all been to Walmart where it's like, there's self-checkout over here.
Yeah.
Or you go to Walgreens or CVS, it's like, now I'm the bagger? Now it's my job to bag everything? It's because when you start raising the prices and they start
losing people,
lowering the amount of employees, they're going to make you do the bagging 100%. Customer.
I think if the average citizen understood economics as well as it was understood by economists 200 years ago, most of the nonsense that's done in Washington would be impossible politically. Economists have very little influence in that sense. The people in Washington decide what they want to do, and they find an economist who will go along with it.
And so I think the real answer to your question is that you must not judge a bottle solely by its label. You have to look at what's inside and see what the law or the measure produces.
Seriously, I cannot understand a single word you're saying.